vanish during the night. These weren't servants who had simply changed positions or been reassigned. These were women who had been part of her household for years, who had taught her English customs and helped her navigate the subtle hierarchies of court life. Their disappearance was so sudden and complete that Isabella knew immediately something catastrophic was happening. When she questioned her remaining French ladies-in-waiting about where the others had gone, she received only evasive answers and worried expressions. By afternoon, the sounds from the courtyard below her windows had changed. Instead of the usual bustle of palace life, she could hear shouting and the clatter of armed men. When she looked out, she saw soldiers wearing unfamiliar livery, their weapons drawn and their faces grim. That evening, Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chambers with news that would haunt the young queen for the rest of her life. Margaret's face was pale with terror, her usual composure completely shattered. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be overheard. "Only the most essential things." Isabella felt her heart begin to race with a kind of panic she hadn't experienced since her first terrifying days in England. She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "To the Tower," Margaret replied, and the words fell between them like stones. She didn't need to finish the sentence for Isabella to understand. The Tower of London was both palace and prison, and in times of political upheaval, the distinction often became meaningless. For a 9-year-old girl who had grown comfortable in her role as England's queen, the Tower represented everything she feared most: confinement, isolation, and the very real possibility that she might never see freedom again. The journey through London's dark streets was unlike anything in Isabella's previous experience. Gone were the ceremonial processions she had grown accustomed to, with their elaborate pageantry and cheering crowds. Instead, they traveled in a small, heavily guarded convoy, surrounded by armed men whose faces showed no trace of the deference she had come to expect. Her litter's curtains were drawn tight, but she could hear the sounds of the city around them. Not the usual noise of commerce and daily life, but something more urgent and threatening. Shouts in the distance, the sound of running feet, the ominous clatter of weapons being readied for use. At the Tower, Isabella was installed in apartments that were comfortable by most standards, but clearly designed to contain rather than simply house their occupant. The windows were barred, guards stood at every entrance, and the very air seemed thick with the weight of confinement. Her French ladies-in-waiting were allowed to remain with her, but most of her English attendants were dismissed. For the first time since arriving in England 5 years earlier, Isabella felt truly isolated, cut off from the world she had learned to navigate and the people she had come to trust. Richard came to see her on her second day at the Tower, and the change in him was shocking. The confident, kindly king she had known was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in a matter of weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a wildness that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of her father's episodes of madness back in France. The parallel was too disturbing to contemplate, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching another king lose his grip on both his throne and his sanity. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair as he had done during their first meeting years ago. The gesture once comforting, now seemed desperate. I'm afraid our circumstances have become quite difficult. Isabella, now far more sophisticated than the frightened 6-year-old who had first arrived at Calais, understood the implications immediately. She asked with a directness that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a child. Richard's smile was bitter. For now. This conversation marked a turning point in Isabella's relationship with Richard and her understanding of her own position. For the first time, he spoke to her not as a child to be sheltered from harsh realities, but as a political equal who needed to understand the forces reshaping her world. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne based on his descent from Edward III, that many of the great nobles had abandoned Richard's cause, and that the future of both England and the peace with France now hung in the balance. The careful diplomatic architecture that had brought Isabella to England was crumbling, and no one could predict what would rise in its place. Isabella asked, displaying a composure that would have been remarkable in someone twice her age. I don't know, Richard admitted, and Isabella could see that this uncertainty tormented him more than his own precarious position. Henry may seek to use you as a bargaining chip with your father, or he may honor our marriage and continue to protect you. This was Isabella's first real lesson in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics. Her value as a person was secondary to her value as a symbol and diplomatic asset. The love and care Richard had shown her, genuine though it may have been, could not shield her from the larger forces that were reshaping the English kingdom. She was learning, at 9 years old, that even queens could become prisoners when the political winds shifted. The next few weeks passed in agonizing uncertainty. Isabella could hear the sounds of the city beyond the tower walls, but she was cut off from reliable news about what was happening. Her French ladies whispered among themselves in their native tongue, but even they seemed to know little beyond rumors and speculation. The isolation was made worse by the knowledge that her fate was being decided by people she had never met, based on calculations that had nothing to do with her wishes or well-being. Finally, on a gray October morning that seemed to mirror the bleakness of her situation, Isabella heard the sound she had been dreading. Heavy footsteps approached her chambers, but these weren't the familiar boots of her usual guards. When the doors opened, she saw new men wearing the red rose livery of Henry Bolingbroke. The guards who had protected her for years were gone, replaced by soldiers loyal to the man who had just seized the English throne. The man who entered behind them was tall and imposing, with the bearing of a soldier and the calculating eyes of a politician. This was Henry himself, now Henry IV of England, come to meet the child who represented both an opportunity and a problem for his new reign. Isabella rose from her chair and curtsied deeply, as she had been taught to do when meeting a king, though she wondered if this man would even acknowledge her royal status. Henry studied her for a long moment, taking in her poise, her obvious intelligence, and perhaps calculating what use he might make of her. "Your Grace," he said formally, and Isabella noted with relief that he still used her royal title. Isabella asked, referring to Richard with the directness that had become her hallmark. She had learned that in times of crisis, euphemisms and diplomatic language could be more dangerous than plain speaking. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. Isabella knew enough about politics to understand that abdicated likely meant was forced to give up the crown, but she didn't challenge the euphemism. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most to her immediate future. Henry's answer would determine whether Isabella remained a queen or became merely a very valuable prisoner. Her fate hung on the new king's assessment of how best to use the peace treaty with France, whether to maintain it or to risk war for the sake of other political objectives. That, Henry said carefully, depends on many factors. With those words, 9-year-old Isabella began the most dangerous period of her young life. The protective bubble of Richard's court was gone, replaced by the harsh realities of a kingdom in transition. She was no longer just a child queen being raised to fulfill her royal duties. The atmosphere in the Tower of London was suffocating. Isabella, now 9 years old, sat by the narrow window of her chambers, watching the Thames flow past like time itself slipping away from her grasp. The child who had once danced through Westminster Palace as England's crowned queen was now a prisoner, though no one dared speak that